Human society is on track for a collapse in the next 2 decades if there isn't a serious shift in global priorities, according to a new reassessment of a 1970s report, Vice reported. In that report, published in the best-selling book, The Limits to Growth, opens in new tab, 1972, a team of MIT scientists argued that industrial civilization was bound to collapse if corporations and governments continued to pursue continuous economic growth, no matter the costs. The researchers forecasted 12 possible scenarios for the future, most of which predicted a point where natural resources would become so scarce that further economic growth would become impossible, and personal welfare would plummet. The report's most infamous scenario, the business as usual, BAU, scenario, predicted that the world's economic growth would peak around the 2040s, then take a sharp downturn, along with the global population, food availability, and natural resources. This imminent collapse wouldn't be the end of the human race, but rather a societal turning point that would see standards of living drop around the world for decades, the team wrote. So, what's the outlook for society now, nearly half a century after the MIT researchers shared their prognostications? Gaia Harrington, a sustainability and dynamic system analysis researcher at the consulting firm KPMG, decided to find out. In the November 2020 issue of the Yale Journal of Industrial Ecology, Harrington expanded on research she began as a graduate student at Harvard University earlier that year, analyzing the limits to growth predictions alongside the most current real-world data. Harrington found that the current state of the world, measured through 10 different variables, including population, fertility rates, pollution levels, food production, and industrial output, aligned extremely closely with 2 of the scenarios proposed in 1972, namely the BAU scenario and one called Comprehensive Technology, CT, in which technological advancements help reduce pollution and increase food supplies, even as natural resources run out. While the CT scenario results in less of a shock to the global population and personal welfare, the lack of natural resources still lead to a point where economic growth sharply declines, in other words, a sudden collapse of industrial society. The BAU and CT scenarios show a halt in growth within a decade or so from now, Harrington wrote in her study. Both scenarios thus indicate that continuing business as usual, that is, pursuing continuous growth, is not possible. The good news is that it's not too late to avoid both of these scenarios and put society on track for an alternative, the stabilized world, SW, scenario. This path begins as the BAU and CT routes do, with population, pollution and economic growth rising in tandem while natural resources decline. The difference comes when humans decide to deliberately limit economic growth on their own before a lack of resources forces them to. The SW scenario assumes that in addition to the technological solutions, global societal priorities change, Harrington wrote. A change in values and policies translates into, amongst other things, low desired family size, perfect birth control availability, and a deliberate choice to limit industrial output and prioritize health and education services. On a graph of the SW scenario, industrial growth and global population begin to level out shortly after this shift in values occurs. Food availability continues to rise to meet the needs of the global population. Pollution declines and all but disappears, and the depletion of natural resources begins to level out, too. Societal collapse is avoided entirely. This scenario may sound like a fantasy, especially as atmospheric carbon dioxide levels soar to record highs. But the study suggests a deliberate change in course is still possible. Harrington told Vice.com that the rapid development and deployment of vaccines during the COVID-19 pandemic is a testament to human ingenuity in the face of global crises. It's entirely possible, Harrington said, for humans to respond similarly to the ongoing climate crisis, if we make a deliberate, society-wide choice to do so. It's not yet too late for humankind to purposefully change course to significantly alter the trajectory of the future, Harrington concluded in her study. Effectively, humanity can either choose its own limit or at some point reach an imposed limit, at which time a decline in human welfare will have become unavoidable. In just a few years, the world as we know it could cease to exist. Sounds melodramatic, I know, but stay with me here. According to researchers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, by 2040 society could be in serious trouble. Their study predicts that economic inequality will reach new heights, social cohesion will unravel, and democratic institutions will come under increasing strain. In other words, things are going to get really bad, and fast. Let's talk about it. 2020 was the first disaster milestone. MIT scientists developed a computer model called World 3 Inches in 1973 to simulate global sustainability. It was supposed to be a fun, silly project, but researchers found themselves alarmed when the computer wouldn't predict past 2040. Humanity had ended by then. In a mad frenzy, those MIT scientists published a book about their study called The Limits of Growth, but no one really cared. No one wanted to hear that civilization will start collapsing by the time they're in their 60s, or swallow the pill that the study was so legit that it was backed by the world's leading scientific organizations and represented real-world data one-to-one. It was too terrifying. So we pushed it off. The first milestone set by the algorithm was in 2020. By then, the standard of living would begin to decline until we hit upon something even more terrifying: human behavior toward technology itself. Whereas early cultures put faith in ancient artifacts like stones or bones from animals long ago, modern man would place the same kind of trust in newer technologies such as cars and computers. We'd eventually land at a place where the need for individual ownership in technology would be greatly reduced. You'll own nothing and be happy. For instance, why buy a car when a self-driving Uber or Tesla could take you and your family everywhere you need to go? Hence, when the World Economic Forum says, "You'll own nothing and be happy," they aren't trying to be an evil Nazi group, they're aiming for the technology to be shared in a communal kind of way. They just have a terrible way of saying it. Obviously, scientists didn't predict COVID-19 or the war in Ukraine, but they did believe that there would be a catalyst in 2020 that would make humans rely more on technology. There may be a collapse, but there will never be an explicit anti-tech revolution. The scariest scenario. Because the study was published in the 1970s, MIT clearly couldn't have predicted iPhones, the internet, electric cars, 3D printing, cryptocurrency, high-quality free porn, or any of the other great innovations of the last few decades. So they didn't try. Instead, they adjusted the initial conditions of the algorithm and ran it over and over again. In some simulations, they assumed innovation remained at a constant pace. In others, they predicted we had wild advances in technology, and in others, we plateaued in industrial output. More parameters they considered were high birth rate versus low birth rate, environmental sustainability versus little or none, high levels of global trade versus low levels. The experiments had a wide range of different results with one thing in common. All of them pointed to 2040 as the year everything went to shit. Here's the scariest part. The trajectory that we are most aligned with has a clear collapse by 2040. In a 2020 study published in the Yale Journal of Industrial Ecology, sustainability expert Gaia Harrington concluded that our exponential increases in pollution and industrial output placed us in the business as usual trajectory, otherwise known as one of the worst trajectories. We would begin to see record declines in industrial capital, agricultural output, and welfare levels, leading to massive unrest throughout the 2020s. And just like how the patricians left Rome and created their own kingdoms to prepare for the Dark Ages before Rome's collapse, we would have similar groups begin to do the same. Harrington said of the study that pursuing continuous growth is not possible, even when paired with unprecedented technological development and adoption. Infinite growth is impossible for any nation, even if the world is united, which clearly it is not. We have a model that demands infinite growth on a finite planet. Necessity is the mother of invention. Don't worry. There is plenty that could be done to save ourselves.